And we still say to this day that, life is just a series of peaks and valleys, but nothing grows on the peaks.
Right.
The growth happens in the valley.
Yeah.
And that's so true for us in our relationship and us as individuals. Every time we've struggled personally,
Yeah.
that's when we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and there's nowhere to go but up.
Hey, welcome back to the Men of Iron podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lehman, as we continue this series called Her Story. Today, we're super excited to have one of almost our own, Men of Iron's own, Ashley Glick, who is the wife of our marketing director, Steve. So we're super excited to get to talk to her today and just hear her story. So Ashley, go ahead and take it away. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So like you mentioned, I'm Ashley Glick, the proud wife of Steve Glick. Stevie, as most people personally know him as. That's correct. We have been married for 9 years. We've been together for 15 years. And together we have 2 girls. Our oldest is Pearl, and she is 7. And our youngest right now, she just turned 4, and her name is Penelope, but we also lovingly refer to her as Peach.
Peach, yes.
And I am currently expecting our 3rd baby, who is due the first week of April.
Yay. So, I always just kind of start out by just asking a little bit, about yourself. What's your faith story look like? Just kind of sort of, we'll start there.
So my faith journey started later in life. I did not grow up in a household that had much value in faith.
Yeah.
Actually, I was raised by my mom and my stepdad. My mom grew up in church. Mm-hmm. My stepdad did also, but it was a Catholic atmosphere, and it was a very rigorous religion, mm-hmm. and it left him with a very bad taste in his mouth. So it wasn't anything that they really cultivated in our house.
Yeah.
So I would say probably in my mid-20s, I started to feel like there was something else.
Yeah.
Like there was more. Like I was feeling this pull towards something bigger. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I had a best friend whose family was very deeply rooted in their faith.
Yeah.
And I remember his parents coming to me, and they're like, if you have any questions, we would love to just sit down with you and show you what this looks like for us. And they did. And that's really where it started. Mm-hmm. And I was so eternally grateful for them. They helped me buy my first Bible.
Yeah.
And it took a long time for me to reach that point where I felt like I was ready to give my life to Christ.
Yeah.
It took a while, and they were with me every step of the way.
Yeah.
And I was so grateful for it. My parents were actually really supportive.
Yeah.
Which was really great.
Yeah.
It was a very organic, very, very spiritual journey for me as a woman.
I have a similar story too. My mm-hmm. family was not, overtly religious either, although, we did all the things. We went to, church sometimes, mm-hmm. Vacation Bible school, that kind of thing. But mm-hmm. I also had a friend that kind of introduced me mm-hmm. And her family. And I just know, from my perspective too, it's always remembering that your story doesn't have to look exactly like everyone else's story.
I completely agree. And I still feel very much in the infancy stage of my faith, mm-hmm. because I feel like I don't have that foundation.
Right.
And I still have a lot of questions and still a lot to learn.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a journey that never ends.
I was gonna say, I think when you speak to even women who are in a different season or in a older season than you mm-hmm. are, they say that they're learning too. So, I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing or, something to consider as a negative, because mm-hmm. I think we're all just walking along in faith, and
we are. And every season that you go into, there's something new to learn anyway.
Yeah.
That relates to you and what you're going through.
Yeah.
So with every season of my life, whether it be marriage or motherhood or what have you, I've always dug in deeper because I know there's more to learn.
Yeah.
And I know there's things that I might have overlooked before that weren't really relative, and now they are.
Right. Exactly. So you're in your 20s,
mm-hmm.
and you meet Steve.
I do. I meet Steve. His mom played matchmaker a little bit.
Okay.
We had worked together for about 3 years before she finally worked her magic.
Okay.
When I met Steve, He was very much, despite our 5-year age gap, which felt big at the time in my early 20s.
Yeah.
We were very much in the same season of our lives. We were very much looking for more.
Yeah.
We were very much on that journey to the same destination.
Yeah.
With Steve, I would say it's safe to say that his journey was a little bit more haphazard.
Yeah.
There was a lot of struggle with drugs and alcohol for him. And then actually later on, I learned that when we had met was probably one of the lowest points of his life.
Yeah.
He had gone to college right out of high school, went for a year, dropped out, and then never moved back home. So post-college, he was in and out of friends' houses, living with a lot of his cousins.
Yeah.
And there was a big party atmosphere there. And drugs were something that were just routine to him. They were just regular. He did them recreationally on the weekends. And then alcohol would typically accompany those types of situations for him as well.
Yeah.
So when we met, I knew all that. But there was something there. Steve has a very genuine personality. He cares about people. He's very smart.
Yes.
Very reserved. And just very genuine. And people gravitate toward him.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And that was me. I was like, in spite of all of this, I know I see it.
Yeah.
I feel it. Yeah. And from the very beginning, we were very deeply connected. And I think a lot of it was because we were two very imperfect people working toward the same goal.
Yeah. And I think that adds an aspect of it, though, too. If you're both newly, in your faith, kind of growing in your faith, like how cool that you both kind of sort of worked and ended up like where you are now versus like it could have gone so much differently.
Right. And we attribute a lot of our successes and our thriving marriage. We are each other's best friends. And again, I said we are deeply, deeply connected.
Yeah.
And I attribute so much of that growing period that we had. So we did wait a decent amount of time before going into marriage. So he proposed at around 4.5 years.
Okay.
And then 1.5 years later, we were married. So 6 years after we met, we were finally married. Yeah. But during those 6 years, even in spite of being married now, we had the most amount of growth as individuals that really binded us together.
Yeah.
And really set us up for success in marriage.
And do you think it was just as important to kind of sort of grow as yourself in your faith? Like
hugely.
On your own individual terms versus as a couple?
Hugely. And one of the things that really was a turning point for Stevie was shortly after we met, he committed to going to a trip to Liberia, Africa, which is a very, very poor country, even by African standards. I remember he had grown up in the church, so this wasn't his first missions trip. This was the first big one.
Yeah.
But I remember him telling me, he's texting me on the plane before taking off, and he said, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, what am I doing? What is God doing with me? Yeah. And I was like, I don't know either.
I have regrets.
I know. And I said, it was a longer trip. It was about a 2-week trip, very, very limited contact with him during that time. But I can very confidently say the person that I put on that plane was not the person I got back.
Wow.
God truly had to pull him away from his environment, put him in a situation that was uncomfortable to be able to speak to him. He just drown it out, that background noise.
Yeah.
And it was just him and God.
Yeah.
That whole trip.
So that's very intriguing to me. So what was that like when he came back from that trip? Like, how did that, walking alongside that, how did that even affect you, or how did that make you feel?
It almost was like he had a clear head.
Yeah.
Everything was in focus. Shortly thereafter, he moved out of the situation that he was in with his roommates, moved in with his dad at the time, went back to school to complete his college education.
Yeah.
Had a very steady job. And we started going to church together.
Yeah.
And all of the things that I knew that he was destined for and that he was capable of, he was finally able. It was finally now in front of him, and he could see it.
Yeah.
And he had a line of attack.
Yeah.
And that was so, it felt rewarding for me because I'm like,
Yeah.
yes, see, this is what I saw in you. This is
Right.
what and a lot of people saw that, his family, even the people around him, friend-wise, that were in that same kind of party atmosphere knew that of him, that he was destined for big things.
Yeah. Yeah. So that leadership aspect really started to come out
Yes.
more as he grew in his faith. And
Yes. He was always critical of himself, but I think the more and more he focused and put his nose to the grind, he started reaping the rewards of his hard work, and he really felt more confident in himself.
Yeah.
He gave up drinking. He actually ended up, shortly after I graduated nursing school, which was about 6 months after we met,
Okay.
he was charged with a DUI.
Okay.
And that took everything he thought he knew and turned it upside down.
Yeah.
He ended up being sober for 5 years from alcohol, gave up drugs, and it just was enough to scare him.
Yeah.
And he knew that this wasn't the life he wanted to live.
Right.
And that was just the straw that broke the camel's back.
I think it's like realizing that you need a turning point, but it's almost like that is often how it happens.
Right.
You know, God puts something in your life that's like, okay, this is not who I want to be.
Right.
You know?
Right. And we still say to this day that, you know, life is just a series of peaks and valleys, but nothing grows on the peaks.
Right.
The growth happens in the valley.
Yeah.
And that's so true for us in our relationship and us as individuals. Every time we've struggled personally, that's when we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and there's nowhere to go but up.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Men of Iron podcast. Men, you are or will be the spiritual leader of your family. This is a big deal, and we recognize that's not always easy. At Men of Iron, we want to help you find the balance in your family and thrive in it. And that's why we created Man's Family, an entire series based on the roles that we each play in our families, helping you become a better son, brother, husband, and father. We all desire to be the men that God intended us to be. Everyone around us benefits when we take our roles seriously as men, and the changes that we make in our own lives can extend through generations to come. Our series of Man's Family will help you change your life. Go to menofiron.org today and find out more.
So what did your, journey look like as just together as a couple, kind of growing in your faith and those beginning years, like it's already hard. You're married. It's like, oh my word. And so for people like maybe like us that didn't grow up in the church necessarily, it's like, sometimes we just have to look around us and say like, okay, well that looks to be working for them. So, what does that look like?
So for us walking in that journey, it came very naturally because we were learning together.
Yeah.
But we also were very fortunate, and it doesn't go without saying that we had a really great support system.
Yeah.
Despite the situation that I was in with my family growing up, they were supportive.
Yeah.
Stevie's family was obviously very supportive. They were elated to see us attending church regularly, and participating in different events and that sort of thing, and just being prayer warriors together. We were doing small groups and Bible studies together as a couple.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to ask, if there was anything that you guys did intentionally as a couple.
We did. And a lot of that we did before we were married.
Okay.
And people are like, oh, you're in a small group? You're not even married? I'm like, but that's our intention. Like we knew that from day one.
Yeah.
We just had to work on ourselves in order to be ready for that.
Well, and that piece too is like surrounding yourself with the people, like even Steve having to leave, I think, from his environment, you know that. I think deep down, you know that.
It is. It's hard.
Yes.
It's a comfort thing. And he just did it so well, and it worked out well for him. But like I said, we had nothing but the best support, church family, family at home, friends. It was, I don't want to say it was a painless journey because it was anything but it was so much easier. Having that support rally around us. So is there
anything that you really like had to, lean in and focus on during those times? Like, it would have been easy for you to be like, this isn't what I was, signed up for type of thing. Like, is there anything that kind of sort of got you through those times in your faith, or was it just support
prayer and alone time, solitude for me?
Yeah.
I'm someone who does my best thinking when I'm by myself.
Yeah.
I remember actually during a rough patch in our dating period, there was a lot of family tension between his family and me. I was a little bit more domineering than they were used to. And Stevie is not a domineering person. So it was a very different way of viewing a relationship for them.
Yeah.
But we actually ended up taking a small break. And I remember diving deeply into the Lord. And that was the time period that I gave my life to Christ.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that would have happened if we didn't have that break, that time where I really had to focus on, okay, it's not him filling me. Yeah. It's the Lord. Yeah. And that's what I'm seeking. Yeah. And then after that, it was just, what can I do for you, Lord? Mm-hmm. What can I do for you? So a lot of prayer for me, a lot of solitude, a lot of communication with him. Like, despite the fact that we may not have been together at that time, or that we were still fighting through like outside issues, not within our relationship, we were constantly communicating all the time.
I am definitely the stronger personality in our marriage too. And I know that's one thing that I struggle with a lot is like, and it came up in another story too that we just did about, you know, this idea of letting go and letting them kind of actually grow into the role that they're created for. Yes. But what does that look like for us as like these strong, you know, more
it's hard.
Women? It is.
It's hard when you're wired that way. Yes. And that's your personality. Yeah. I still struggle with that because I can, and he's very much keep the peace. Yeah. So he just lets me go with things sometimes, but I'm like, no, like we have to do this together. This is just as much you as it is me, despite the fact that I just am more aggressive about it. Yeah. But we are really, really good communicators. And I attribute that a lot to the time that it took us to get to that marriage point. Yeah. Because we didn't have any other choice but to be communicating because there was just so much stuff going on in our lives as individuals. Yeah.
So fast forward, then Stevie becomes a part of Men of Iron. And
Stevie does become a part of Men of Iron.
What was that beginning of that journey like? What are things you noticed?
You know what? It made so much sense for us. Yeah. We are coming at this from a multifaceted position. He's been through the program,
which is huge.
Huge, right? Yeah. He's been through it as a mentor multiple times and as a protege multiple times. Yeah. The connections that he made are lifelong. Yeah. Lifelong. And we believe in it so much that we've made a career out of it for him. Yeah. But it just made sense for us. Yeah.
What are the benefits of those? You said like being a protege and a mentor, like what were things that you saw through that process?
I mean, some of those 15 years ago, I bet you he first started being a mentor being a protege with his mentor. And that's still a lifelong friendship there. Yeah. A lot of what they talk about, we keep pretty confidential, but just knowing that he wasn't alone and a lot of the times if a woman says something to him, he's like, oh, okay. But then his friend tells him and he's like, oh. So you could see some of the things that were very obvious to me that maybe weren't necessarily to him, but him hearing it from a friend, from his mentor, really started to get the wheels going. Yeah. Started to get him thinking. But yeah, he's gone through it. He's been there. Those friendships are lifelong. And they helped get him through some very difficult times in his life.
This is a theme that's coming up throughout this series. It's this idea that, you know, as women, we have no problem getting together and sharing and doing
we make day dates out of it, right? To talk about life.
But for guys, it just comes a little less naturally. And, you know, yes, they share things with you, but how important is that, you know, safety or whatever, confidence in your mentor or your protege, like being able to share.
And there were seasons where he was going through the program as a protege and there may not have been any reconciliation or any type of resolution during that time, but just walking alongside of somebody, having somebody hold you accountable and just talking to somebody about what's going on is just so much of a weight lifted in itself. That it just gets you going on the right track. Yeah. You know, it's not this end all be all, the answer to all your questions. Yeah. It may not be that for you. Right. But there's so much value in having somebody with you during these trials and tribulations, especially it being a man. Yeah. I mean, it's so unheard of that I love that they're creating this space and this time to make that the norm.
Yeah. Yeah. And this idea too of like finding balance. I know that came up a couple of times also, like, what does it look like to be balanced in all areas? And how does that impact you? I mean, as a wife, you know, or how does it impact him as a father? Have you seen any, you know, as far as like going through the program and that kind of thing, or even just in your faith, you know, your faith, like.
I do. He's always been someone who has tried to be better and do better.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to toot my own horn,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think he is the best, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had so many people tell me, well, not everybody has a Stevie. And I get that. Like, I get that. I do.
Yeah.
And the people that know him personally, I think would have to agree with that. His legacy is being a husband and a father to his kids, and that's his top priority. And I think the balance that Men of Iron has brought to our lives is allowing him to acknowledge that he's not the best.
Right.
And that there's room for improvement and that it's okay.
Yeah.
You know, nobody's ever going to reach that finish line of being perfect and finally my work is done.
Yeah.
You know, Steve and I work really well together as a couple in terms of parenting, but we've recently just hit a season with our oldest where it's not as easy for Stevie now.
Right.
And we're working through these different scenarios, and we're working on ways that maybe he could approach her differently in different situations that wouldn't necessarily trigger both of them.
Yes.
And I think that finding that balance and finding it by bouncing ideas off of other men who have been there is so invaluable.
Yeah. And I think too, like the reason why Steve is the way he is because he put in the work. That's the other part.
I agree.
Like,
I agree.
It's not just like, oh, everyone wishes, you know, they had a Steve.
I agree. I remember, I forget what it was, where I was very open about Stevie's past, and my mom heard me and she's like, does Stevie want you saying that sort of stuff?
Right.
Like, does he want people? And I'm like, but listen, part of what makes him so personable and so genuine and so approachable is that life wasn't always humble to him.
Right.
You know, that's a huge part of who he is, and it's a huge part of his story.
Yeah.
And I honestly think that he is better because of what he went through in his 20s.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I definitely think too that one of the hardest points in our marriage, and I'm sure in his life, is the death of his father. Was a huge burden. That was one of the hardest situations in our marriage, for sure. He was not the strong half full person that he was, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't. I was like, I don't know how to react to this. You know.
But did you find then? Do you feel like God kind of sort of equipped you in that season?
I do.
Okay.
I do, and I also feel like he was working through a mentorship at the time. That was huge for him, and I think once we finally cleared the air, and I'm like, listen, I'm just trying to give you space. You are a processor,
right?
You internalize things, and I'm just trying to give you space. And then when we finally talked about it, he's like, actually, I don't want space. I want to talk about this. And I'm like, oh my gosh. Okay. Well, this is what I'm made for. Like, I love to talk about things.
Time to shine.
This is me. Yeah. And it took a long time for us to get back on the horse. But again, that was one of the things that will always stick with me as being the absolute hardest part of our marriage and his life. So, and rightfully so.
But just walking alongside and like staying and leaning into your faith versus, you know, whatever, just allowing it to kind of sort of create a wedge or whatever.
Right. And then there were times where I start talking about certain things to him in that season where he lost his father, and he just didn't want to hear it. Like, you know, he's just so hurt and broken that nothing is going to make him feel better. And, you know, but you are just staying consistent, and eventually he, you know, grief takes over, and he starts to go into then a different season or a different stage of grief, and we can kind of talk about things more. And
well, thank you for coming, but we're not quite done yet. But I always like to end with, you know, we don't know if there's women listening. We hope there are, but what is some encouragement that you could give someone who maybe is walking a similar path, you know, that you have, that has a husband that has gone through things or whatever, and what would you say to them?
I think one of the things that I've always kept in the back of my mind is don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up on the person that you know he is. Everybody hits rough patches. And it changes people.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah.
But to his core, and to, I think most men have this in them, they are good people. They want to do better. They want to provide. They want to do these things for their families, for their spouses. And sometimes they just get off track.
Yeah.
You know, there's this, in this crazy world, there's so much to deter you.
Yeah.
There's so much pulling you away. That's the enemy's way of getting you away from the Lord.
Yeah.
And I think in my mind, I've always just thought, no, stay the course, stay consistent, stay prayerful, and don't give up on, I mean, for me, it was always don't give up on him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because all the things that I saw in the very beginning are still there. They've always been there. They've been there since he was a kid.
Yeah.
And that was always my driving factor.
Yeah.
Was staying consistent with him and not giving up on him and being encouraging.
Yeah. And just walking alongside. And
yeah.
digging deep.
And not always being the answer to everything.
Right.
Which is hard because
Yes.
as women, we always want to fix.
100%.
But just being there.
Yeah.
You know, that was that. And sometimes staying off to the side. It can be hard sometimes, but.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for
You're
being
welcome.
here. We love Steve. So it's,
I'm so glad I get to share him with you guys. Yes.
yeah. Yeah. I think he's a key part of our team and we all know that. So yeah.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this series. We hope that you, got something out of it. And we're grateful that you gave us the opportunity to share these stories. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Men of Iron podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share. At Men of Iron, we exist to change a culture one man at a time, and we'd love to have you partner with us. So go to menofiron.org to see how you can get involved, or donate at menofiron.org/donate.